Okay, so hi everybody. Today we are introducing the Module 8, which was developed by the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network alongside Include Me Too. So next slide. So the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network is the only Commonwealth network which provides a platform for disabled children and young people to connect, share learning, develop skills and knowledge, and to advocate and influence on disability rights, inclusion on the CRC, which is the Convention on the Rights of Children, and the CRPD, which is the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And the implementation of those conventions at a national, regional, and global level. CCYDN provides a strong voice and platform for disabled children and young people to strengthen their voices, increase the representation and recognition in their roles as key agents, change makers for positive change, for advocating for disability rights, equity, and for a better future. The Disabled Commonwealth Children and the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network was established in response to a lack of representation of children and young people at a Commonwealth level, and a lack of representation of children and young people in Commonwealth networks and at forums such as at the United Nations and other international forums. Disabled young people felt strongly that a Commonwealth disability-focused children and youth network was needed to ensure that they have an independent voice and to access platforms and to raise issues and share learnings and solutions in areas that matter to them, and to improve disability inclusion, rights, advocacy, and representation for and with them. The Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network was launched during the Commonwealth Week in London in March 2019, in partner with the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Royal Commonwealth Society. CCYDN is an affiliated Commonwealth Youth Network as part of the Commonwealth Youth Programme alongside several other networks. CCYDN is the first ever Commonwealth Disability Children and Youth Network driven by disabled children and young people and supported by Include Me Too, who work closely with the Commonwealth Secretariat to establish the network. So next slide. So in Module 8, the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network have written about a number of areas which support children and young people, as well as those that support us to learn about children and young people's rights and how they can be advocated for in the Commonwealth. So the sections of Module 8 include Section 1, which is a human rights framework supporting and protecting the human rights of disabled children and young people. Section 2, which is the impact of stigma, taboos, and discrimination on disabled children and young people's rights and interventions. Section 3, the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter. Section 4, the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 Agenda and disabled children and young people. Section 5, COVID-19 disabled children and young people advocate for the protection of their rights. And Section 6, which is the role of disabled children and young people in the human rights and disability movements. So now I'm going to pass over to another one of our presenters, Parmi, who is going to present the next section.
Thank you ever so much, Heidi. So the next section, we're talking about human rights. and the human rights of disabled children and young people, and the framework that supports them. The rights of a person are human rights because they're human beings and have basic needs to live, survive, develop, thrive, and have the right to be safe and treated with dignity. When a person's rights are violated, when they're being denied their basic needs, they are being treated as less. The basic human rights are being denied. Human rights are for all persons, including disabled persons, which include disabled children and people whose rights must be respected and protected and acknowledged. Still left behind the lives of disabled children and people. There's an estimation of between 180 and 220 million youth with disabilities worldwide, and an estimation that there are 93 million children with disabilities, of which nearly 80% of them live in developing countries, already one of the most disadvantaged groups. Children with disabilities are one of the most marginalised and excluded groups in society, facing daily discrimination in the form of negative attitudes, lack of adequate policies and legislation. They're effectively barred from realising their rights to healthcare, education, and even their survival. They're often denied access to cultural or leisure activities or information support about reproductive, health, sexuality, and other areas that are vital for a child's seamless integration into society and his and her growth and development into adulthood. The international human rights framework is important to promoting and protecting the human rights of disabled children and people, particularly the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So many of their lives are impacted disproportionately as children with disabilities live in poverty. They are disproportionately vulnerable to both physical and sexual abuse. Mortality for children with disabilities may be as high as 80% in countries where under 5 mortality as a whole has decreased to below 20%. Children with disabilities are almost 4 times more likely to experience violence than non-disabled children. Parents and medical professionals who murder children with disabilities often receive reduced sentences and use mercy killing defences. This reflects the belief that the lives of children with disabilities are not of equal value to other children. At least 90% of children with disabilities across the developing world have no access to education, and the violations of their rights are often severe. Worldwide, up to 68% of girls and 30% of boys with intellectual or developmental disabilities will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. The United Nations Convention on the Child was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1989. Its significance cannot be overestimated or overstated, as this was a landmark in placing for the first time both children and disability in the international human rights law field, and the first international treaty to ensure civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights of all children under 18. The CIC provided a holistic human rights framework underpinned by 42 articles regarding the protection of the human rights of children and treatment as subjects of rights, insisting that they're respected as key actors in exercising their rights and their participation on things that matter and affect them. So it's really played a key role in recognising that disabled children and young people as right holders, as all children and people as right holders. The CIC has 4 main principles known as general principles. And these cover non-discrimination so that all children have equal and have the same rights, and that the best interest of the child is the heart of everything to ensure that their basic needs are fulfilled, and that they have a right to life, survival and development, and so they can have the opportunity to reach their full potential. And a right to be heard, that every child has the right to express their views, their feelings and their wishes in all matters that affect them. In the CIC, a key article is 23, which explicitly speaks about disabled children and refers to them. And it ensures disabled children enjoy a full and decent life, which includes participation in the community. Disabled children have effective access to and receive education, training, healthcare services, rehabilitation services, preparation for employment and recreation opportunities, ensuring the fullest possible social integration and individual development of disabled children, including their cultural and spiritual development. And in addition to this, Article 2 also gave children a right to freedom from discrimination on various grounds, including disability, as a specific ground for protection against discrimination. And this recognised that disability is a human rights issue. The rights of disabled children and young people under 18 are not confined just to CRC Article 23, but rather the duties and rights set in the article were intended to ensure they had maximum opportunity to realise their rights set out within the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child. We're just going to now show you a short clip on a video that talks a little about the Convention Rights of the Child.
In numbers alone, children are central to the world we live in, as they make up a large and important part of society. Investing in children is both an opportunity and a duty.
It is an opportunity because the gains achieved through better nutrition, healthcare, education, and protection are likely to be far greater and longer lasting than those in almost any other area. And it is our duty because children everywhere have human rights from the very beginning of their lives. These rights include the right to survive and develop, to be protected from violence, abuse, and exploitation, to have their views respected, and have actions concerning them to be taken in their best interests.
These rights are found in a number of treaties and international standards, most importantly in the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC. The CRC matters more than many people imagine. For one, in recognising that children have rights, it becomes the government's responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfil these rights, rather than an optional act of charity or kindness. The CRC binds governments to a set of internationally accepted human rights articles that must be followed. This means that people who work for the government must consider and apply the provisions of the CRC in all aspects of their work affecting children. The CRC provides a way to monitor government's progress on children's rights, and a basis for children's organisations, advocates, and children themselves to argue for change. Full implementation of the CRC goes a long way to ensuring that each child's entitlement to equality, dignity, and respect is upheld. There's been a long-standing focus on protecting vulnerable children as a charitable response to suffering. However, at the start of the 20th century, some activists started promoting the idea that children should have rights. In 1924, with the aftermath of the First World War, Eglantine Jebb and others campaigned for the first International Declaration of the Rights of the Child. During the International Year of the Child in 1979, Poland proposed that there should be a convention for children. Over the next decade, countries around the world debated and negotiated the text of what would become the most widely supported human rights treaty the UN ever produced, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The United Nations is an international organization committed to maintaining peace, security, and promoting human rights. One of the ways it does this is through international human rights agreements. The CRC is one of these and sets a global human rights agenda for every person under the age of 18. It was recognized by nearly every UN member state in 1989. And is now the world's most ratified human rights treaty.
So you've heard a little bit about CRC. Now, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is part of the United Nations Human Rights Frameworks. And it really did reinforced the human rights of children and young people under CRC. Prior to CRPD, persons with disabilities were largely left out of development and human rights policies. Pre-existing human rights conventions, such as the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, offered considerable potential to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities, enshrined within the rights of all people. However, this potential was not being tapped, and the persons with disabilities continue to be denied their human rights globally. The CRPD was therefore a response to the significant gaps in the areas of both development and human rights to support full inclusion of persons with disabilities in their societies. As we go through the presentation, you'll see that we're using the two terminologies when we're describing disabled people. The information that we've got in the slide is actually taken also from the course book. So some of these are also quotations that are referenced in the many references that are in the course book that accompany this course. So we are going to be using the terminology in terms of social model, which is disabled children and people, and also the international language and the language used under CRPD, which is persons with disabilities. So just wanted to confirm that. So now we'll move on to the next slide, which looks at the CRPD has a particular article, just like CRC had Article 23 that was very particular to disabled children and people. CRPD have a particular article that really talks about the rights of children with disabilities, and that is under Article 7, which is dedicated to children with disabilities, introducing obligations to ensure the enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis and with other children, to ensure the best interests of the children with disabilities a primary consideration, and to ensure that they have the right to express their views on all matters affecting them on an equal basis with other children, and to be provided with disability appropriate assistance to realise those rights. CRPD has specific provisions for disabled children in several articles. Article 3, to respect the evolving capacities and their right to preserve their identities. Article 4 emphasises that they have the right to be consulted, involved when governments are developing and implementing legislation and policies that concern them. Article 13, the access to justice. Article 16, freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse. Article 18, liberty of movement and nationality. Article 23, respect for home and the family. Article 24, right to education. And Article 30, participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure and sport. Links to the full articles are also within the course book accompanying this module and this presentation. So CRPD further enhanced, we've just referred in this slide to the articles in CRPD that are particular for disabled children and young people. And this further enhanced the existing articles in CRC. Superstition, the myths, beliefs vary within region to region, even within a country, within small communities and within families themselves, impacting the lives, survival and development of disabled children and people. Behind the statistics and the denial of many of the rights of disabled children throughout the world lay attitudes which viewed the life of a disabled child as being of less worth, less importance and less potential than that of an able-bodied child. Those attitudes must be challenged. There are many factors which contribute to disability stigma. And these are just a few, and there's a lot more information in the course book itself as well that you can read upon. But these are just a few of the contributing factors. Lack of understanding and awareness regarding the causes of disabilities and their resulting characteristics is a key factor in the stigma experienced by people with disabilities. Disability is often blamed on misdeeds of ancestors, misdeeds of parents, mainly mothers, misdeeds of persons with disabilities, supernatural forces such as demons, spirits, witchcraft, or punishment or fate from God. The misconceptions about the causes of disability often result from cultural or religious beliefs, and they're often reinforced by ill-informed and insensitive media coverage that perpetuates the negative views of disability. The impact of stigma, taboos and discrimination on disabled children and people's rights, survival and safety cannot be ignored, as they face greater risk of violence, abuse and neglect than their non-disabled peers. There is much to be done and much that can be done. There needs to be a challenge to negative perceptions, betrayals and prejudices, and strengthening the implementation of CRPD to further enhance safeguarding interventions, enforce and introduce legislation to protect and eliminate disability discrimination, violence, abuse and harmful practices. Needs to be increasing opportunities for disability awareness, understanding and recognition of disability rights, and the respect and acceptance of rights of disabled persons. Positive narratives, attitudes, media coverage, representation and portrayals of disabled people is very much needed. And grassroots advocacy and action, communicating messages on disabilities in a way that harmonizes with local cultural values and activities, supporting community and faith leaders in roles to reduce disability stigma in developing countries, has also been seen as effective. Addressing disability stigma, self-advocacy plays a crucial role, because advocacy and self-advocates, through their work and participation, serve as role models of inclusion, helping other disabled persons overcome internalized stigma and changing negative perceptions and the narratives that exist within communities. The Lenin Cheshire Disability Young Voices programme, for example, reported that young campaigners with disabilities from Zimbabwe who went on a speaking tour of 6 secondary schools, and they reached 12,000 school children and were able to change the way the school, children and the teachers saw disability. There's also a key role for families, as parents have been central in improving perceptions of disabled children and the fight against negative attitudes and discrimination. Families play a key role to build the resilience and for that child, the child's strong sense of belonging, self-identity in the face of stigma. So important to actively nurture children's development, their child's development outside their home and participating in family and community events, despite attitudes from others. It's so important that this plays a key role in increasing the acceptance, the visibility within communities and understanding. Information is key, as myths and superstitions persist because they go unchallenged. Parents and carers sharing information, advocating for rights, sharing the challenges and barriers they have to overcome solutions and positive impact on their child and positive stories is so key. Advocacy, in terms of self-advocacy and parental advocacy, have played a key important role in bringing the needs and rights of disabled children to the attention of politicians and officials, and improving provision of support services and inclusion. Some DPOs have found that by working within communities, they were able to transform negative attitudes and harmful practices in those communities. For example, a study conducted by African Child Policy Forum in Ethiopia found that the presence of active DPOs or disability inclusive NGOs at community level resulted in major positive differences in attitudes towards children with disabilities. Legislation and policy is also key and plays a key role in terms of remedying harmful cultural beliefs and practices and preventing discrimination against people with disabilities. And this is also amplified in Article 8 of the CRPD. Media plays an important role in terms of positive reporting and encouraging using non-discriminatory and more positive and accurate language is so important for stigma reduction. And reporting and documenting of abuses is key in terms of for persons with disabilities. It's essential for bringing little known practices to light and for generating advocacy strategies to combat often deeply rooted belief systems that allow such persecution to continue. And finally, we need to end disability stigma, taboos and discrimination, as it is instrumental to achieve disability equality. As children, young people and adults with disabilities have a right to have a sense of belonging, to be respected, to be safe and to thrive. We are now going to move on to our next presenter, who is Jonathan Andrews, and he will give an insight to the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter and the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 in terms of the role of disabled children and young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Palmy. So just to give a brief overview of the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter. Disabled children and young people representing 23 countries, 20 of which were in the Commonwealth, took part in the Children and Youth Programme, including two delivered during the Global Disability Summit in 2018. And that supported the facilitation of disabled young people to lead, participate and represent on the international platform. Through the Civil Society Young People's Workshop, online survey, youth-led Twitter discussion and global video campaign, participants' views were collated on the 6 themes of the Global Disability Summit, changes they wish to see, challenges and barriers experienced, how they wanted to be included and able to contribute, and suggestions for youth, Global Disability Children and Youth Charter. And as a result of the bringing together and the collation of this information and the views and the desires of these children and young people across the globe, the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter was really able to be formed, which was drafted by Include Me Too, very much using the thoughts and desires and views of those young people across the world and across the Commonwealth in drafting its response and the focus of what that charter is all about. And the charter sets out 12 really key and very important points to focus on in terms of really building young people's and children's rights and opportunities in terms of disability. And they include inclusive education, participation and representation, gender equality, safeguarding and ending all forms of abuse and harmful practices, inclusive and accessible communities, digital and technology, economic empowerment and employment opportunities, removing stigma and discrimination, support and well-being, humanitarian crises, legislation and policies, and data. And it's important to remember as well that these aren't just individual different areas that are distinct from each other. Actually, they do often overlap. So inclusive education is really important to get children and young people with disabilities that real start to allow them to access employment, for example, that then might allow them to influence legislation and policies in future and have good support and well-being. So it's important to remember that these all are linked in terms of really allowing disabled children and young people the best chance of really living their life to the full and achieving their potential and influencing their ability to stand up for their own rights. And just a few quotes from people who attended the Global Disability Summit about the Charter. Anna Lucia Arellano from the International Disability Alliance, the chair of that, said, "I support the Children and Youth Charter of this Global Disability Summit because I believe that inclusion is a must, is urgent and is now, and especially because I think and I believe that our children and our youth deserve a fair and equal and especially an inclusive world." And also Gopal Mitra from UNICEF, who said, "I support the Global Disability Summit Charter on children and young people because I want children and young people to be at the centre of the development agenda and for children and young people to really access and understand their potential." And those are just a few of the, really positive views that many young people and many of those who support, young people's access to this support have given. I'm also here to talk to you about the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda for disabled children and young people, and how that also links in. So the SDGs are a global call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. And the SDGs very much aim to leave no one behind and make a commitment to reaching the world's most marginalised groups. Disabled children and young people should be an important priority for the SDGs, with estimations of between 180 and 220 million youth disabilities worldwide, 93 million children with disabilities, with a large number of children with developmental disabilities under the age of 5 years. And to give it, an example of some of these SDGs, SDG 1 is no poverty, for example, and actually the link between that and disability is very stark, because the systemic review showed a strong link between childhood disability and poverty. SDG 2 is zero hunger, and actually studies have shown that children with disabilities are more likely to experience malnutrition than those without. Good health and well-being is SDG 3, and actually a study by Plan International across 30 countries showed that children with disabilities were 5 to 10 times more likely to report a serious health condition, both related to their impairment as well as general illness, than children without disabilities. And SDG 4, which is quality education, there's a study by Plan International that showed that children without disabilities were 5 to 10 times more likely to be excluded from school than those without disabilities. So this is obviously there's a very big overlap in terms of what the SDGs are focusing on, and actually support that needs to be given for children and youth with disabilities. And even beyond those particular SDGs, there's also general SDGs to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable and inclusive institutions at all levels. And SDG 10, reducing inequality, and SDG 11 and 9 both talk about inclusivity in terms of infrastructure and human settlements being accessible. So that inclusion, that accessibility, and the importance of supporting people with disabilities is really key actually to achieving the SDGs. And it's really important that when NGOs and GPOs and organisations, national organisations and governments are looking into how to achieve those SDGs, that they don't leave disabled children and young people behind, that they very much recognise that there are particular barriers disability often throws up that need to be addressed, and that if you don't address those, you won't be able to achieve that eradication of poverty and supporting everybody to be able to achieve their full potential. Of course, the Global Disability Movement continues to engage and advocate to ensure the SDGs implement the CRPD within its delivery at a national level. And to realise the rights of disabled children and young people, the UNCRC, the UNCRPD, and SDGs can make this possible by applying Nothing About Us Without Us and Leave No One Behind to disabled children and young people, and really make sure that they're completely 100% part of that. Because inclusive and disabled children and young people participation is more than just child and youth engagement. It's actually about treating us as equals and important partners and advocates in driving change. So that's just a brief overview of the SDGs and the Children's Charter. And now I'm thinking I'm handing over to Parmi to talk about COVID-19.
The Commonwealth Children Youth Disability Network worked with a group of disabled young people who were representatives of DPOs, disabled people's organisations, and NGOs, non-governmental organisations from Fiji, Malta, France, India, Maldives, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Mauritius, Australia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Canada, and United Kingdom. And this is all during the pandemic, where they came together on online platform to share about the key concerns they had about the impact of the pandemic on the rights of disabled children and young people and the impact it was having on their day-to-day lives. And together they developed the COVID-19 Children and Young People with Disabilities Statement and recommendations. The statement asks countries to action recommendations to ensure all efforts to address the COVID-19 pandemic support their rights as children and young people, and that are also outlined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and also emphasised in the Global Children and Young People's Disability Charter. The COVID-19 Children and People's Global Statement and Recommendations has been endorsed by many key disability rights and children and youth organisations. And hundreds of individuals have all shared the statement, and a number of government officials have expressed their support. But this campaign is not over, it is still very relevant and is key to the pandemic's response and recovery in protecting the rights of disabled children and young people. Furthermore, it demonstrates that the role of disabled children and people have in matters that affect them and how they are key contributors in the disability rights movement. And this is an example of so many about the strength, the resilience and the contribution that disabled children and people have in the disability rights movement. And in this slide, it's an overview of the recommendations that young people came across. So once again, there is a link to the course in the course book that you can look further in terms of the recommendations. Each of these recommendations have been aligned with CRPD, CRC, and the Global Disability Children and People's Charter. And the recommendations covered inclusive, accessible education and learning development, health and social care, accessible information, social distancing, support and well-being, participation and representation, young women and girls with disabilities, and safeguarding and protecting from all forms of abuse and harmful practices. Economic empowerment and employment is in the recommendations, as is stigma and discrimination, independent living, and the role of legislation and policies and data collation. All these 12 recommendations are broken down in terms of key relevant areas that disabled children and people view as important and that need to be responded to, and have the commitment of all stakeholders to ensure that their rights are upheld and protected. We are now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Joseph Miguel and he will be talking about the role of disabled children and young people in the human rights and disability movement, and also will be concluding today's session with sharing considerations for yourselves to take forward, and also how you can also get involved with the work of the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network. So Joseph, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Pami, for that introduction. While the importance of the role and input of disabled children and young people is enriched in international human rights treaties, such as the CRC and the CRPD, children and young people have often been excluded from international human rights forum and disabled people's movements. A critical element is to support existing disabled young people's networks and forums, supporting and sustaining disability youth-led organizations and networks, building upon their efforts, working with them as partners, and strengthening the promotion and advocacy of the rights of the disabled children and young peoples. DPOs and NGOs, governments, and stakeholders to recognize and support the innovation and development of the methodologies and tools developed by disabled young people to promote their human rights, social justice, and to listen to their voices, to promote their advocacy and disability work, to support their campaign, and respond to their calls to action. Commonwealth Children Youth with Disability Network provides so many examples of how the inclusion and participation of disabled children and young people does have a key role in the children, youth, disability, and human rights advocacy and delivery. CCYDN officially launched with a disabled young people's delegation of an official site event organized with the Include Me Too, that is strengthening the participation, inclusion, and rights of children and young people with disability. At the United Nations in New York during the 12th session of the Conference of State Parties of the CRPD in June 2019. The network's members have represented and presented on behalf of CCYDN on many platforms, including ECOS, OSC, Queen's Commonwealth Trust, South Asia People's Forum on SDGs, CDPF, Disability Inclusive Forum, United Nations, Davos, and several official Commonwealth functions. Worked with Include Me Too on the COVID-19 hospital communication passports. The resources was a response to the pandemic, supporting disabled people access communication while supporting their rights, safety, and dignity during health and medical care and treatment. CCYDN worked with youth, DPOs, NGOs, translating the resource and delivering training and trainer workshop, establishing local partners and focal points in Maldives, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Tanzania, Zambia, Cameroon, Kenya, Australia, and Fiji. The other initiatives include the Ideas Capacity Building Program and Masterclass Series. This was delivered during the November 2020 to March 2021, supporting disabled young people to increase and build their skills and confidence as disability rights representative, change makers, and advocates. 33 countries were represented. There were 50 places to the program and was oversubscribed by the Commonwealth Children and Youth with Disability, accommodates 125 disabled young people taking part. Includes also the Empowering Youth with Disabilities in Rwanda, a group of young people with disability established Uwezo Youth Empowerment. It is a cross-disability organizations whose mission is to serve as platforms for children and youth with disabilities to share their experience and to support them in building their advocacy capacity. Also, the other one is Making It Count by Leonard Cheshire, the power of youth advocates in disability movement. The Making It Count project focuses on realizing the potential of youth with disabilities by empowering them to see themselves as experts and their own experience. A network of community reporters collected constituent perspectives, provided insights that informed advocacy and peer support. In total, 332 reports were collected between June and September 2018. The other initiatives was by the European Disability Forum Youth Committee. The EDF Youth Committee has priorities each year and has focused on the following over recent years. In 2018, education and Erasmus program. In 2019, on employment. In 2020, had focused on freedom and movement. And in 2021, had the focus on housing and independent living. The other one is young people in the disability movement in Australia. In 2020, Women with Disabilities in Australia started up its first ever WWDA. This is Youth Advisory Group made up of young women and non-binary young people with disabilities. In the same year, the National Organizations for Disabled Young People, CYDA, also ran its first ever National Disability Youth Summit in recognition that the disabled rights movement did not adequately include young people or the experience. Advocacy is not just about getting to the table, while a new set of advocacy is not just about getting to the table with a new set of interests. It's about changing the size and configuration of the table to accommodate the whole new set of actions. Effective and meaningful disabled children and young people's participation in society requires to ensure they are aware of their rights, to express themselves, engage, and participate in decision-making processes on matters that affect them, and encouraging them to exercise their rights and as active citizens to bring about positive social change. Enabling disabled children and young people as right holders, social actors, and advocates to express their views and opinions, to be taken seriously, and to be included in the decision, action, planning at a local, national, regional, and international level. Disabled children and young people role in disability movement is critical and will impact positively in the disability youth and human rights movement, while ensuring they can have a better future. Now, going ahead, addressing the areas of consideration in speaking of the role of disabled children and young people in human rights and disability movement. These areas include: what are the key challenges in your country that are experienced by disabled children and young people? Which of the commitment from the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter can you support and advocate for, and what actions will you take to make this possible? In your country, how are the disabled young youth involved in advocacy and in disability rights movements? And the other one is, if you are a disabled young person, how are you being supported by disabled rights advocacy and being included to participate and represent on issues that matter to you and your peers? These are the areas of consideration. Much of the information can be found on the CCYDN. This is Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network social platforms, including Twitter, which is at CCYD Network, CCYD Network, and also email at ccydn@includeme2.or.uk. So thank you very much for listening.